It was just another ordinary school day for 14-year-old Kayla. She was an honor student, active in after-school clubs, and loved to read. But on this particular day, something was different. As Kayla sat in her English class, trying to focus on the assignment, Mrs. Dawson, her teacher, snapped at her in front of the whole class. "Kayla, stop looking out the window. Pay attention to the lesson," Mrs. Dawson said sharply. Kayla, usually quiet and well-behaved, glanced at her teacher, confusion in her eyes. She hadn't done anything to deserve the reprimand. Still, she nodded, refocusing on her worksheet, hoping to avoid further conflict. But it didn't stop there. Later in the day, Kayla was called to stay after class. Mrs. Dawson handed her a detention slip with a stern look. "You need to work on your attitude, Kayla. You can't be looking out the window and not paying attention in class. We can't have students like you disrupting things." Kayla's heart sank. She had never caused any trouble. But Mrs. Dawson had it in her mind that Kayla had an attitude problem. This wasn't the first time she'd felt unfairly treated. It stung, but Kayla had learned to keep quiet and let it go. After all, her father always told her, "People will judge you no matter what, but how you handle it defines you." However, this time, something inside Kayla snapped. This wasn't just about being unfairly punished. This was about her dignity. She wasn't going to take it lying down anymore. That evening, Kayla walked into her home, her shoulders slumped. Her father, Marcus, a tall, strong man with a quiet presence, noticed right away. He looked at her with concern as she dropped her backpack by the door. "Kayla? What's wrong?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with tenderness. He knew something was off by the way she held herself. Kayla hesitated for a moment. She had always felt like her father was her rock, her protector, but she hated burdening him with her problems. Still, she couldn't keep this inside. "School was awful today, Dad. Mrs. Dawson gave me detention for no reason. She said I had an attitude problem just because I looked out the window," Kayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus felt his blood start to boil. He knew his daughter was a good kid, and he also knew that sometimes she was treated differently, unfairly, because of who she was. He had always tried to shield her from it, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. "What? You didn't do anything wrong, did you?" Marcus asked, his tone firm but calm. Kayla nodded. "No, I didn't. But she doesn't like me, Dad. She never has." Marcus could feel his protective instincts kick in. He had worked hard his whole life to make sure his daughter had every opportunity she deserved. But now, hearing about the treatment she had received from a teacher, he felt an overwhelming need to act. "Tomorrow, I'm going to the school," Marcus said, determination in his voice. "I'll get to the bottom of this. You don't deserve to be treated like that. Nobody does." Kayla looked up at her father, her face filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Dad." Marcus gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll make sure this never happens again." The next day, Kayla's father walked into the school with a quiet confidence. What neither Kayla nor Mrs. Dawson knew was that Marcus was no ordinary parent. He had recently been appointed as the new director of the school district, a position that carried a lot of weight. Marcus was well known in the community for his advocacy for education and his commitment to fairness. He had been in the district for years, working his way up, but this new role gave him a platform to make a real difference. As Marcus walked through the halls, the usual hustle and bustle of a school day seemed distant. He was here on a mission, to protect his daughter and ensure that other students wouldn't have to face the same treatment. Kayla was already in the principal's office, nervously sitting on a chair as she waited for the conversation to begin. She had no idea that her father was about to make a powerful entrance. When Marcus walked into the office, the principal looked up in surprise and Kayla's jaw dropped. "Dad? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to talk about your teacher, Kayla," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. Principal Harris, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stood up. He knew exactly who Marcus was, but he wasn't sure how to handle the situation. "Mr. Walker, I wasn't expecting you today." Marcus ignored the principal's surprise and focused his attention on the issue at hand. "I heard about what happened in Mrs. Dawson's class. My daughter does not deserve to be treated like that, and I won't stand for it." The principal opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus raised a hand, stopping him. "This is not about Kayla. This is about a pattern of behavior that I will not tolerate in this district. Teachers should be role models, not bullies." Before the principal could respond, Mrs. Dawson entered the room. She looked taken aback when she saw Marcus standing there. "Mr. Walker, I didn't expect to see you here. Mrs. Dawson said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Marcus turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. I think you should have expected me, Mrs. Dawson. I'm here as the new district director, and I have zero tolerance for mistreatment of students, especially not my daughter. Mrs. Dawson blinked in surprise, her smug attitude faltering for the first time. She hadn't recognized Marcus when he entered the office, but now, hearing his title, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. This wasn't a parent she could easily dismiss. I didn't know, Mrs. Dawson stammered, trying to regain her composure. I thought Kayla was just being disruptive. She's been, well, difficult in class. Marcus didn't buy it. So, you decided to call her out in front of the entire class and label her as having an attitude problem? Is that what you do with all the students who don't fit your idea of what's acceptable? Mrs. Dawson's face flushed as she tried to explain. It's not like that, Mr. Walker. I have high standards, and sometimes the students don't live up to them. High standards? Marcus repeated, his voice low. You're punishing a 14-year-old girl for looking out the window? You're punishing her for being a teenager? He paused, letting his words sink in. You don't get to judge students based on your personal bias, Mrs. Dawson. Not under my watch. Kayla watched in awe as her father stood his ground. She had never seen him so powerful, so confident. Her heart swelled with pride. The silence in the room was thick. Mrs. Dawson fidgeted in her chair, avoiding eye contact with Marcus. Principal Harris shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. Finally, Mrs. Dawson spoke, though her voice lacked the confidence it had just moments before. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, I didn't mean to hurt Kayla. It was wrong of me to assume things about her. Marcus wasn't satisfied. Sorry doesn't cut it. You've been treating my daughter and likely other students unfairly. This needs to change. Kayla sat quietly, processing what was happening. Her father's words had the power to bring about real change, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rise within her. We will be holding a meeting with all staff to address the issue of bias and respect, Marcus continued. And I'll be monitoring how teachers interact with students. If I find any more incidents of bullying, there will be consequences. Mrs. Dawson looked down at the floor, her face red with shame. I understand, Mr. Walker. I'll make sure to do better. The next day, Marcus made good on his promise. He held a district-wide meeting for all staff, addressing the importance of fairness, respect, and accountability. The teachers and staff were attentive, and there was no room for complacency. Kayla watched from the sidelines, her heart filled with pride. Her father wasn't just standing up for her, he was standing up for every student who had ever been treated unfairly. It was clear that things were going to change, and change for the better. By the end of the week, Mrs. Dawson had personally apologized to Kayla, promising to be more mindful of her behavior. Kayla accepted her apology, but she knew that things would never be the same. Her father had shown her that standing up for what's right was the most important thing you could do. And as for Marcus, he had taken the first step in a new era for the school district, one where every student was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. It had been a long and challenging week, but Kayla felt a sense of peace. She knew her father had made a difference, not just for her, but for every student who had ever felt small or unheard. As she sat at dinner with her father that night, she realized just how much he had sacrificed for her and for the community. He wasn't just a dad, he was a leader, someone who truly believed in making the world a better place for everyone. Dad, Kayla said, her voice full of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. You've really changed everything. Marcus smiled, his eyes warm with love. You don't have to thank me, Kayla. I did it because you're my daughter, and because it's the right thing to do. And with that, Kayla knew that no matter what challenges came her way, she would always have the strength to face them, knowing her father would be by her side, fighting for what was right.